Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect and thankfully very, very warm. It is cold this morning. I had to go full hoodie. So is this the first day of fall? First day of fall, and I got to go full hoodie. It got cold real fast. Anyway, hope you guys are nice and warm. Let's dig into Tuesday's Q&A. This comes from Raj. So I'm assuming it's Raj with the J. And Raj says, considering the perspective of your model, do you find value in any of the traditional assessment tools taught us in physical therapy school, like manual muscle testing? I'm having trouble finding a good rationale to support its use. I get it. I don't use manual muscle testing a lot. So a couple things come to mind. If you find it useful, by all means, go ahead and use it. If it helps you make a better decision, by all means, use it. But let's look at it from a couple of perspectives here. Is that one, it's based on a faulty premise that we can somehow isolate individual muscles, and then that is somehow useful or valuable. Always remember that the construct of individual muscles is a man-made concept. So we decided that we had individual muscles, and therefore the structural reductionist model would default to the fact that we can somehow isolate them out, and that is somehow valuable or useful. Where manual muscle testing may be useful, Raj, is in the case of where we might assume that there is a neurological insult of some sort. So we could talk about anything from a lesion of the nervous system to an infection that might influence the nervous system's ability to produce output, and therefore we may be able to identify that through some measure of the inability to provide resistance during a manual muscle test. So if we had like a nerve root compression or something like that, we do a battery of neurologic tests, we may be able to formulate a presentation that would provide us some information. So for instance, like great toe extension or dorsiflexion being weak in some cases where we would have proximal nerve root compression, it might be useful. Crush injury, something like that, where we have a peripheral nerve issue, and maybe we can identify some limitation in force production. And again, it may help us create a little bit of a picture in that regard. When we have an intact nervous system, I think we've got a whole different perspective that we have to take into consideration. The traditionalist view is that we have weak muscles, which would be like this intrinsic quality within a muscle, that there's a problem with a muscle, and they would call it weak. But again, I think it's just a bad interpretation from a bad model. So let's use an example. So if I was to say that we were going to do sort of hip flexion and side lying or something like that, and so I have you raise up your leg in traditional hip abduction, which is actually external rotation, and I push down on it and it gives way, and I say, oh, you have a weak, okay, we'll say gluteus medius. Here's the problem with that, is we all know that if I have an anterior orientation of the pelvis, the musculature above the trochanter actually changes its direction. So traditionally in dead guy anatomy, we would call these muscles external rotators, but if I anteriorly orient to the pelvis, their angle of pull actually changes direction, they become internal rotators. So if this traditional hip abduction is external rotation, but I have the muscles that are oriented to pull and internal rotation, of course it's going to test as if I have a weakness, but it's not an intrinsic problem with the muscle itself. Excuse me. It's just the orientation of the pelvis to begin with. So how can I use this? Well, maybe I can use it as a test-retest. So like I do identify your inability to produce force in a certain direction. I recapture the ability to fully anteriorly and posteriorly orient this pelvis, and now maybe I do have something that might be useful. Now, the thing you also want to consider is that all of our movement is based on shape change. So if I measure something in a context, I measure something on the table, I say, wow, I've recaptured all this really cool range of motion. I have full excursion of internal and external rotation. I have full excursion of inhalation to exhalation. And then I stand you up. So now I've changed the context. And so now my isolated measurement becomes less useful because I'm dealing with a much more complex situation where I had this interaction of the entire body in space. So now my range of motion representations become infinitely more important than any form of isolated muscle type quality measurement, because no matter where I express the range of motion, whether it be on the table, on my side, on my back, or standing up. To access that range of motion, I have to use the same compression and expansion strategies. So again, in a complex movement, like a split squat, for me to access 90 degrees of hip flexion in a split squat, I know I need to be able to access hip internal rotation under those circumstances. Otherwise, I'm going to have to use a compensatory strategy. And so these situations are not dependent on these isolated muscle actions. And so the manual muscle test under these circumstances really doesn't help me. So my range of motion measures are infinitely more useful to me than some form of isolated manual muscle test. So I don't really use it under most circumstances, because most of the people that come to see me are typically neurologically intact. And so again, I just wouldn't use it under those circumstances. So Raj, I don't think it's totally useless. Out of respect to Florence Kendall and all those many folks that came before us. I appreciate their work. I just don't think that, again, I don't think it's a good representative model. I don't think it's based on a good model. So its use, it becomes very, very limited. So hope that sheds a little light on from my perspective. Again, if you like it, use it. If it's helpful, use it. If you make good decisions from it, use it. Otherwise, let's put it in its place. Everybody have a great Tuesday. I'll see you tomorrow.